Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Okay, so we shall continue on the gradual training. And I think I said a few days ago that I was going to match the gradual training with the Noble Eightfold Path. And maybe now is just to look back a little bit and just have a quick look at how the gradual training actually matches in with the Noble Eightfold Path. And of course what you see here is that the Noble Eightfold Path begins with right view. And that is, in a sense, that is what arises when the Buddha comes into the world and somebody hears his teachings. That is the acquisition of right view. That's where it all begins, right? You hear the Dhamma, a certain degree of right view arises, and that is the beginning of the path. And then when the person then decides to become a monastic, or perhaps also a dedicated lay follower, it doesn't say that in this sutta, but I think that's also implied to some extent. Certainly when you renounce and you become a monk, that is like right intention. Intentional renunciation, right? And you intend to renounce, that also includes the intention of non-violence, non-harming, and non-ill will as well. And then from that intention, that's when you start practicing the good life. So you practice the virtues, samma vaca, samma kamanta, samma ajiva. These are the factors of sila on the path. And then once that has been purified, that is when you come to the refinement of the mind itself. So when the external virtue has been purified, you come to the virtue of the mind. And that was what I was reading out yesterday, is the beginning of the purification of mind. When you become content with what you have. Because contentment is the opposite of desire. When you're content, you have no desire. So that is the start of that sense of purification of the mind. And at that point, as I said yesterday, and I think this is a very important thing, is that you experience a sense of happiness. The anavajja sukha, the bliss of blamelessness, because you cannot be blamed. You have a certain degree of purity inside of you. So because of that, that is the beginning of the happiness arising here. And this happiness is basically what we want to cultivate. We want to see that arise when we know that we are practicing in the right way, if we have a sense of happiness inside of us. If we haven't got a sense of happiness, then probably it means that there's something more that we need to purify here to allow the happiness to arise. So from this point on, we continue with the purification of the mind, and after the passage on contentment, the next one then is the standard passage on sense restraint, how to restrain the senses. And the idea of this is basically to avoid unwholesome states to arise in the mind, right? This is the purpose of this one. So this is how this particular passage reads in the gradual training here. On seeing a form with the eye, he does not grasp at its signs and features, since if he left the eye faculty unguarded, evil or bad, if you like, unwholesome states of covetousness and grief might invade him, he practices the way of its restraint. He guards the eye faculty here. He undertakes the restraint of the eye faculty here. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there, because that paragraph is quite difficult to understand perhaps exactly what it means, particularly if you read it for the first time. So I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail to try to explain what is going on here. So what is the first phrase here, on seeing a form with the eye? That just means you are seeing something, right? Whatever it is. Your eyes are open and all these things come into your mind as a consequence. You do not grasp the sign. The sign here is the nimitta, and the features are the vyakadana. So the nimitta in Pali often just means the object, right? So you see an object, you see another person, right? You see some food, you see a house, whatever you see is an object, the main object. And Bhyanjanas, which are not Vyakarana, Nimitta, I haven't got the Pali quite straight now. Anyway, the features are aspects of that object. So if you see a person, you can focus on different aspects of the person, right? The hair, or the eyes, or the hand, or whatever. You see food, you see a whole table, you focus maybe on a particular type of food that you really like. So you focus on an aspect of that object. So the idea here is just to say anything that you grasp onto, anything which looks pleasurable to you. It doesn't matter if it's the whole object or just an aspect of that object. If you grasp onto it, that is when problems start to arise. So what does it mean to grasp onto it? What does that actually mean? And what it means is that you allow it to linger in the mind, right? You see something you like, something beautiful, and then it fastens in the mind. It doesn't just slide past and disappear, it fastens in the mind. So you think about it afterwards. That's one way of grasping. You think about it afterwards. Another way, classical way of grasping, is that you look at something and then you look back, right? Because you look first of all and then you realize, actually, that was something nice there, and you look back again. And that looking back again is the mind hasn't let go. So it's another sign that you are grasping at that particular thing. So that grasping is just the mind lingering at that nimitta, at that object or the aspect of that object. And of course the reason why the mind lingers is because it finds something attractive there, right? And that is the problem. So then it says, since if he left the eye faculty unguarded, evil is not a very good word, bad I think is much better. Papa is the Pali word, and it means basically bad. Evil has lots of other connotations in the English language. So bad, unwholesome states of covetousness and grief might invade him. Covetousness and grief, again, I do not find a very good translation for what is happening here. You can imagine if you see something you like, what is happening in your mind when you see something you like? You feel attraction, right? You feel attracted towards it. Or you feel maybe a like for something. Or you can maybe say that you just feel desire. Desire is a very simple word. The Pali abhijja often just means desire. So essentially you feel desire. And then the other word here, grief, I think is very misleading. Grief is something you have if a family member dies and you sorrow because the person has died. That's usually what grief means. That's not what happens when you see something you don't like. You don't feel grief. What you feel is dislike, perhaps, or a bit of aversion, or a bit of negativity towards that thing, right? So desire and aversion, like and dislike, pleasure and displeasure. These are the sort of translations which I think are more appropriate in this context. The reason why the translations sometimes are a bit awkward is not necessarily because the translator doesn't understand. It's important to know what's going on here. The reason is very often simply because the translator has a system of translation to choose one English word for one Pali word. And sometimes, even though the context doesn't fit properly, you stick to that system of translation rather than changing it. That is often the reason why this awkward translation sometimes come into existence. So basically, the evil, the bad, unwholesome states of desire and aversion. You don't like what you're seeing, it's ugly, you have aversion towards it. You like it, desire starts to arise, right? So this is the problem here. This is what we're trying to stop, to avoid these things arising in the mind, particularly aversion, which then often can lead on to negativity, to maybe to ill will or whatever. That's kind of the beginning of ill will sometimes, particularly if it concerns people. It can often lead into the area of ill will. So to do that, it says here, your practice is the way of its restraint, right? So again, we have a word here, the word restraint. What does that mean, that you restrain the eye faculty here? And again, the feeling in the English language when you talk about restraint, it's like an act of will, right? You restrain another person means you hold them. It's like you literally hold them back. That's what restraining actually means. But this is not necessarily the meaning in this particular context. The meaning here is anything which stops those negative states from arising. That is what is meant by restraint here. So by avoiding the negative states from arising, however you do that, that is what is meant by restraint. And important to keep that in mind. So you guard the eye faculty. He undertakes the restraint of the eye faculty. So the idea here, to be able to do this kind of practice, you restrain the faculties, you need two things to be able to do this. And the first thing you need is actually a degree of mindfulness, right? Because you have to be able to see what is going on in your mind. You have to see that you are about to be attracted to something, you're about to have aversion towards something, and that takes a degree of mindfulness. If you have no mindfulness, things just run through your mind all the time. You're not really clear about what is going on. So that is the first thing. So this assumes that at this point in the practice, we already have some mindfulness. Maybe mindfulness is the wrong word. Maybe sampajanya or something like that is better, because mindfulness is very refined often. But there's some clarity about what is going on, clear comprehension perhaps. So why is it? How come that we have already now some degree of mindfulness and clear comprehension? Where does that come from? And the reason why at this stage you have that is because you have practiced purity in body and speech, you're practicing contentment with your life, and all of these things lead, as it says above, to a sense of blamelessness, a happiness of blamelessness. So if you feel a certain amount of happiness inside of you, contentment inside of you, that happiness means it's much easier to stay in the present moment, right? One of the reasons why it is hard to have mindfulness is because the present moment isn't pleasant. It's not nice to be here. If you have done lots of bad things and you feel bad inside of yourself, you want to distract yourself by thinking about the past, thinking about the future, about enjoying sensual pleasures, all these kind of things. And that is the problem. But once you have a sense of happiness inside of you, of contentment with what is there, that is when mindfulness becomes possible, because it's nice to be here. You want to be here. Why do you want to be somewhere else if you're happy right here and now? So this is part of how mindfulness comes to be established, is by making the present moment a pleasant abiding right here and right now. So that's how mindfulness, a certain degree of mindfulness has already arisen at this point, and that is why sense restraint becomes possible, and that's why it is at this point in the practice, not before, but at this particular point. So it takes that degree of mindfulness, and then the second thing it takes, once you realize that something is about to happen which shouldn't be happening, then the second point is you have to turn away from that object, right? So mindfulness tells you something wrong might happen, then you have to turn away. So how do you turn away? And again, you can turn away by willpower, by forcing yourself to look in another direction. But if you use willpower, you will find that in the long run, it is not really sustainable, because it's tiring to use willpower. After a while, the mind gets exhausted, it doesn't want to do it anymore, it rebels, and then you cannot actually keep up your sense restraint. So willpower is difficult. Also, the other problem with willpower is that you haven't really understood why you're doing it. You're just holding it back by force without really understanding what is going on. So a much better way of restraining, this was what I was talking about yesterday when we're talking about the soil remover sutta, is to use a sense of understanding, of wisdom if you like, to remind yourself of why you shouldn't be doing these things, why they are dangerous, why they lead to suffering. And that use of wisdom is much more powerful, because when you use wisdom, the thing disappears, and when it disappears, it doesn't come back again very easily. If you just restrain, hold back, the defilement can come back very fast. But if you use wisdom and you see clearly, it disappears much more in a much more powerful and complete way. And it means you don't have to use force, you don't have to use willpower. All you have to do is remember something from the past, remember a certain perception, remember a certain danger, or why you shouldn't go to this place. So that is, and I will show you later on that this is how the Buddha actually teaches the avoiding or the abandoning of the defilements by using wisdom. So this then is how sense restraint comes about. It comes about through mindfulness, awareness, and then reminding yourself why you shouldn't be going this particular place. Okay, So then, having done that then for the eye, of course the same is then true for also the other senses. So, on hearing a sound with the ear, on smelling an odor with the nose, on tasting a flavor with the tongue, on touching a tangible with the body, on cognizing a mind object with the mind. He does not grasp at its signs and features, since if he left the mind faculty unguarded, bad, unwholesome qualities of like or of desire and aversion might invade him. So he practices the way of its restraint. He guards the mind faculty. He undertakes the restraint of the mind faculty. So what you notice here is that it concerns all the five senses and also the sixth sense, the Buddhist sixth sense, which is the mind itself. Even there, you have to have this sort of restraint. So, you have a memory coming up, a certain perception coming up, and you know that this perception leads to desire and aversion. So you look in a different direction again. And then it says, possessing this noble restraint of the faculties, he experiences within himself a bliss that is unsullied. So this is a higher bliss than the previous one, right? As we practice this path, the degree of happiness, the degree of bliss is always increasing, always becoming higher. And the reason why this bliss is called unsullied, well, previously we were blameless in our bliss, but because we sometimes still have a bit of ill will, we have a bit of desire and these kind of things, it is like it's not a pure kind of happiness. It is sullied by desire and ill will. Because desire and ill will, they are like worldly phenomena. And the worldly phenomena don't match with the spiritual happiness. So if you can avoid those worldly phenomena, these things which disturb the mind, which lead to craving, not content in the present moment, which lead to ill will, which is painful in the first place, if we can avoid those, then it's like you have much more purity of mind. And that purity then is the unsulliedness of that happiness. So it's a higher degree of happiness again. So here we are gradually moving up, finding more and more happiness, more and more peace, and meditation starts to happen in this way. Okay, so that is the restraint of the senses. Now this is a very important part of the Buddhist teaching, this restraint of the senses, and it is often connected with monastic life. It can also be applied with some success in lay life. So I think it's important to look at this. Certainly when one is on retreat, it's important to have a certain degree of restraint. So I want to look at this in quite a bit more detail before I move on in the gradual training here. So now I want to turn to a different sutta. I'm going to go forward to the two kinds of thought, Majjhima Nikaya 19. So you have to skip 2 or 3 suttas, and then you come to MN 19, two kinds of thought. Okay, have you all found it? Yeah, is it clear? Okay, good. So this particular sutta, it tells us about how to avoid the bad thinking and how to turn towards the good thinking. So this is, in my opinion, a very important sutta. It focuses on something that is very important in important aspect of the spiritual path. And it also concerns sense restraint, because sense restraint is also about this. It's about turning away from the bad and focusing on the good instead. This sutta is a bit more broad than just sense restraint. It's about abandoning the hindrances and abandoning the bad thinking in a much broader context, not just sense restraint, but also in the context of later on the path when we abandon the hindrances completely. This sutta also concerns that. So it's a bit broader, but because it relates to sense restraint, I think this is a good point at which to have a look at this sutta. So this is how it goes. Thus have I heard. On one occasion the Blessed One was living at Savatthi, in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. There he addressed the bhikkhus thus. Bhikkhus, Venerable Sir, they replied, and the Blessed One said this. Bhikkhus, before my awakening, when I was still only an unawakened bodhisattva, it occurred to me, Suppose that I divide my thoughts into two classes. Then I set on one side thoughts of sensual desires, thoughts of ill will, and thoughts of cruelty. And I set on the other side thoughts of renunciation, thoughts of non-ill will, and thoughts of non-cruelty. So here we have a sutta where the Buddha talks about his own practice before his awakening, before he became a Buddha. And as I said a couple of days ago, it's fascinating how the Buddha teaches from his own life, his own experience. Obviously what he's trying to say is that this is how I practiced. You should be practicing in the same way. You should follow my example. That is essentially what he's saying when he says these things. And then he divides his thinking into two classes. And these two classes are basically on the one side, the unwholesome thoughts, the bad thinking that you want to avoid. And on the other side, the good thinking that is part of the Buddhist path, which leads towards awakening, right? So you have sensual desire, you have ill will, and then you have, it says here, cruelty, which again I don't think is a very good translation. It has more to do with the coldness towards being, callousness, ruthlessness, being inconsiderate, harming other beings. That's essentially what it means. Not really caring for beings. It's the opposite of compassion, right? Compassion is when you care. This is why you don't really care at all. And then you have the other side. You have renunciation. The giving up of desire, basically, is what that means. Thoughts of non-ill will. This can be regarded as thoughts of metta. Metta is, of course, non-ill will, but it's a bit broader than metta. It's also things like upekkha, for example. Upekkha is non-ill will. So it is a bit broader than that, but it's certainly metta is the most obvious example of non-ill will, and it is the way you overcome ill will for the future. Non-cruelty, non-harming, that is very similar to karuna, to compassion. But again, slightly broader than that. So this is the first thing the Buddha does. He sets up these two classes. He understands. Already there's quite a profound understanding here, right? He has actually understood what is wholesome and what is unwholesome. Most people don't even understand that. Sometimes actually it's quite difficult to know. You look into your own mind, there might be very weak defilements there. Is the mind in a wholesome state? What are the defilements that remain? It's not always very obvious. It can be quite hard to know sometimes. So the Buddha then goes on to say, as I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute, a thought of sensual desire arose in me. I understood thus, this thought of sensual desire has arisen in me. This leads to my own affliction, to others' affliction, to the affliction of both. It obstructs wisdom, causes difficulties, and leads away from Nibbana. When I considered this leads to my own affliction, it subsided in me. When I considered this leads to others' affliction, it subsided in me. When I considered this leads to affliction of both, it subsided in me. When I considered this obstructs wisdom, causes difficulties, and leads away from Nibbana, it subsided in me. Whenever a thought of sensual desire arose in me, I abandoned it, removed it, did away with it. So, the first thing the Buddha says here is that as I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute. So the very fact that you are dividing your thinking into two parts, already you are abiding in a diligent way. Actually, diligent, not a good translation. Heedful is probably better. This is what Venerable Bodhi uses now. This is the appamada, right? You are heedful. Heedful means like careful. You are, you consider things carefully. You don't just go ahead and do things without being taking care, basically. Ardent and resolute. This is about just, being careful, having energy, and applying yourself to the task. So that already, just this idea of dividing your thinking, is already being heedful, being energetic, practicing in the right way. It's interesting how he uses the words here, right? And why is that the case? Well, basically because this is part of
yoniso manasikara. Yoniso manasikara is wise reflection, right? You're reflecting in the appropriate way. Whenever you have yoniso manasikara, you are on the right track, you're on the right path. When you lose that, you're on the wrong path. So that's why this is being heedful, because you are reflecting in the right way. So he says, while I did this, as I have classified the thinking into two parts, then a thought of sensual desire arose in me. I understood thus, this thought of sensual desire has arisen in me. Now that already is actually quite difficult. That may seem obvious, and of course sometimes it is obvious. Sometimes we know that we have a desire, right? There's a desire for food or whatever it is, any sensual object. Sometimes the desire is very strong here, and it's very clear that you are afflicted by desire here. But what the Buddha is saying here is not just that, he's saying that whenever sensual desire arises, he knows what it means. So in other words, this implies a very big understanding of sensual desire, all the types of sensual desire, from the very coarse to the very, very refined desires. And this is often the things that block people from entering deep samadhi, for example, is maybe a very lingering sensual desire that is still there. You haven't abandoned it 100%, but you can't even see it because it is so refined sometimes. And that's what they say, that it's only after a deep samadhi you can actually understand these hindrances and these defilements, because only when it's completely gone can you actually look back and say, now I know what that sensual desire was. Before that, we are so conditioned into a certain way of looking at the world that we're not even able to recognize the very refined sensual desires in ourselves. So what the Buddha is saying here is that he has actually been able, through his own wisdom, to recognize the full scope, the full breadth, the full range of sensual desires. And this should also be part of our practice. Certainly in monastic life it is obviously very important to investigate and to actually know the full range of these things. Only when you understand the full range will you be able to eliminate and abandon the full range. Prior to that, it is of course impossible to do so. So this is the first thing here. Understanding this actually is not as simple as it may seem on the surface. It's a very broad category here. And then the next thing that he understands is that this leads to my own affliction, to the affliction of others, to the affliction of both. Now why is it that sensual desire leads to the affliction of people, or to the affliction of any being at all? And this is something that is very unpopular, particularly, I mean, in the Buddhist culture it's probably more accepted that these kind of things. But if in the West, Western world, we say that sensual desire leads to suffering, or it is very, it is a kind of teaching which is very, very unpopular in the Western world. People don't want to hear that. Why? Sensual desire, this is what life is about. You've got to enjoy yourself, otherwise you become repressed and sad person unless you do these things. So it's very hard. It actually takes a lot of work sometimes in the West to explain to people why this is a problem. But really, the way to find out why these things is a problem is just to read the suttas. And the Buddha talks about these things in many different places. And one of the places is like in the Maha and Chula Dukkha Kanda Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 13 and 14. He talks about the problem of sensual desire specifically. And one of the reasons why sensual desire is a problem is that usually it is conjoined with ill will. Ill will and sensual desire almost always go together. And there is a beautiful sequence that you find sometimes in the suttas. You find it in the Mahanidana Sutta, in the Digha Nikaya, for example, Digha Nikaya 15. It has a sequence. It shows you how from desire, from craving, it leads to conflict with other people. And it goes, you may have heard about the sequence, it starts off with desire, and because you have desire, you become possessive of what you have. Because you are possessive, I can't remember the exact details now because I haven't got it with me, but something like this. Because you're possessive, you guard it, and when you guard it, then other people want it, or, then conflict arises. And then you take up sticks, and as it says in there, and you start brawling and quarreling and arguing here. So whenever we are possessive about something, whenever we feel that we own something, we attach to something, then often that can be a source of conflict because other people want it too. And the tax man comes and wants to take some of your money in taxes, or the burglar comes and steal it, or maybe somebody else feel they have a right to the thing that you have a right to. It always leads to problem when we have attachments to things. It always causes, often leads to anger and ill will. You know what it's like, in particular in relationships. Relationship is a classical one that can lead to so much problems. You know, you have a partner in life, and because you have a certain amount of attachment to that partner, if they do something which is displeasing to you, it leads to pain inside, right? This is part of that problem. And often leads to ill will if that other partner maybe speaks to somebody else, you feel that in a wrong way or whatever. Again, it can lead to negative mind states. So relationships is often a great source of suffering in this way. So this is the first thing, that attachment or sensual desire is very closely related to ill will. If you have one, you will also have the other. Of course, ill will is much broader than just relating to sensuality, but regardless, if you are a sensual person, there will always be a degree of ill will conjoined with that sensuality. So that is the first reason why it is dangerous and why it's painful. And eventually you will start doing wrong things because of sensual desire. And the other thing is just that, is that if you have desire, there comes a point when that desire becomes so powerful that it starts to guide your life, it starts to take over your life. And when desire takes over your life, you lose perspective. You forget what is right and wrong. You forget that you shouldn't be doing this, and you start perhaps cheating people or defrauding and doing things which are unbecoming because of desire. The classical example, of course, is adultery, right? This is the classical thing here. It is driven by desire. At the time it seems so right, and then afterwards you regret it so much because you have hurt somebody who you actually really love much more than the other person. But this is a classic example, and that is so common. I've seen some statistic of adulterous behavior. It is extremely common around the world. Something like 50% of people indulge in these kind of things. Why? Because of sensual desire. So it skews your moral compass. You can't see properly anymore. Your sense of morality gets distorted, and then you start doing the wrong things. So again, this is caused by sensual desire. And then you have sensual desire in its own right. When you look at sensual desire, you look into yourself, you look at craving, what it feels like, and you realize that craving itself is a state of lack. It's a state of not feeling complete, not feeling fulfilled. And it actually is a painful state. And if you compare a state of craving compared to a state of peace, it is very obvious which one is more beautiful. And this is directly in the First Noble Truth. In the First Noble Truth you have piyehi vipayogo dukkho, right? Piyehi, the desire, the loved, the things that you like. Vipayoga means separation from what you like. That is a state of suffering. That often is what craving is. Craving is a separation from what is liked. Apiyehi sampayogo dukkho. Apiye is what is disliked. Sampayoga is like connection with the disliked. So that is when you are together with somebody, you don't really like them perhaps, or you find it difficult to be with them, but the situation is such that you have to be there, or whatever it is, then that is the connection with the dislike. And again, that is a craving there. You want to get out of that situation. You're not feeling a sense of fulfillment, you're feeling a sense of lack, something is missing in that one. So craving in its very own right is suffering. And then of course, in the last resort, craving, sensual desire is a problem because it is one of the ties that ties you to existence, ties you to samsara, and it will ensure that you continue being reborn again and again and again, potentially endlessly in the future. And if you do get reborn again and again, then sometimes, because of cause and conditions, you will be reborn in bad states, in bad destinations, where there's enormous amounts of suffering. That's just the nature of things. Remember, you're not really in charge, right? because you're not really in charge, because of anatta, it means that the conditions outside of you will determine to a large extent which way you head. You get the wrong kind of friends, you get in the wrong kind of company, you get reborn in a mafia family. You know, imagine getting reborn in a mafia family. You don't have much choice, right? They all tell you, well, you got to do these bad things, otherwise you're not part of the family anymore. And because of family attachment, you will tend to go that way. You will do what they say. And then things go in the wrong way. So these are some of the ways of reflecting on sensual pleasures. I think this is particularly important for monastics, because in monastic life it becomes very difficult. Too much sensual desire becomes very difficult in monastic life, but it's also good for lay people to some extent, because it guides the mind in the right direction. It takes away some of the excessive desires that may sometimes appear in the mind. So this is how you think, how it leads to your own affliction. And of course it leads to the affliction of others as well, because as I was saying, we tend to guard things. It leads to ill will, it leads to conflict, it leads to all these kind of things when we have sensual desire. And then it says it leads to the affliction of both. So what does that mean? We have just said it leads to our own affliction, it leads to the affliction of others. So what does it mean it leads to the affliction of both? It seems like it's already covered. What I think it means is that sometimes we think, well, even if it is bad for me, at least I will do this because it's good for others, right? Or we think it's good for me, so I don't care what it does to others. Sometimes we can think like that. But the point is, sensual desire is bad for both in all situations. Even, it's not as if I'm doing something good for myself and it will be bad for others. It always is bad for both parties, and that is the problem. So this then is the way to think. And remember, these are perceptions in the mind. They are ways of reflecting here. And because there are perceptions in the mind and ways of reflecting, a way of looking at the world, they are things that we can develop. We're used to looking at the world in a certain way, but we can actually develop these perceptions. And this is a very large part of the Buddhist path, is to learn how to look at the world in the right way, or maybe not right way, but in a way that is conducive to the practice of the Dhamma, to the practice of meditation. And to be able to do that, this is something you have to do again and again and again. And gradually your view starts to shift. Part of that is reading the suttas, as I mentioned the other day, because the suttas are basically right view. When you read the suttas and you reflect on the content, basically this is what happens. You start to go in the right direction. But you also have to apply yourself, like in daily life or on retreats like this, and to change your perception and come to understand what suffering actually is, where there is suffering, to understand sensual desires in the right way. And as you do that, gradually, you come to see this. And the more you see this, the more of a tool this becomes that you can use in your own life and in your own meditation practice. When it becomes a very powerful tool, and this was what we saw yesterday, the Pachavekana Bala or Patisanka Bala, whatever it is, this power of reflection, then it becomes a power of reflection. All you have to do is remind yourself, this is suffering, and remind yourself of the reflection you had in the past, and then the mind automatically goes away, because that has become a very powerful force of reflection in your practice. So this is then how it works. And as the Buddha then says further down here, when you do that, you actually abandon that, remove it, you do away with that thought by reflecting in this way. And this was what I was saying on the very first day. We were talking about how you obliterate the thinking. Remember that? The very strong words that were used there. You obliterate them, you terminate them. The Pali is exactly the same. It doesn't look like the same because the translation is different, but the Pali behind the words is exactly the same. The Pali is pajahati. Pajahati is to abandon. Vinodeti, to like dispel or do away with. And what is the last one? You can't remember. It doesn't matter. But the Pali behind it is the same anyway here. So that is how it disappears. That is how you overcome it. And you can see how this is about wisdom. It's about understanding. It's not about using willpower, right? This is what is the beautiful thing about this. So this is what I meant. I said I was going to show you that the Buddha talks about using wisdom in overcoming defilements, not willpower, and this is what I'm showing you right now. So that is the first way of using wisdom, and there are further ways, and the Buddha says, the next thing he says is that he thought that it obstructs wisdom, causes difficulties, and leads away from nibbana. Obstructs wisdom, the Pali there is panya nirodhika. Nirodhika is cessation. It literally means that it makes wisdom cease. That's what it means. So sensual desire makes wisdom cease. That's quite interesting, isn't it? First of all, the very fact that it makes wisdom cease. I mean, why are we on the Buddhist path? I think of myself often why I'm on the Buddhist path. Well, one of the main reasons is because I think the idea of wisdom is very appealing to me. Isn't it nice to be a wise person? Isn't that one of the reasons why we would like to be Buddhist, because we want to be wise? What does it mean to be wise? Well, the real meaning of being wise is really understanding about suffering and happiness in life. Right? I sometimes think to myself about those times when, those people I have considered wise in my life. And they are the people I go to and I ask for advice about something in my life. And they tell you something very simple and very easy to understand. And that often helps to solve the problem, right? Like when you were a child, maybe you had a grandparent or an uncle or something, or an auntie or whatever, and they would help you and they would put you on the right track. And basically what they do is help you to solve the suffering in life and move you towards more happiness. And this is what wisdom is about in Buddhism too. The Buddha is kind of the best of uncles, if you like, the best of Kalyanamitas, who always has the right answer to suffering and happiness. That's why we go to Buddhism. So that is what wisdom is about. What a wonderful thing that is. Now, sensual desire obstructs that. It destroys it. It makes it cease. So if it makes cease, if you no longer know what is suffering and what is happiness, then essentially that's obviously a very serious problem. So that's a very good reason to get rid of sensual desire. So why is it that sensual desire makes wisdom cease? How does this actually happen? And it is quite simple, really. If you think about your own life, sometimes you have very strong desire for something. You have to have it, and maybe sometimes because you have a very powerful desire, you do something wrong in the process of acquiring that object of your desire. While the sensual desire is there, you're not able to see that you're doing anything wrong. You rationalize it. You think it is okay in this particular situation. Afterwards, when the sensual desire has disappeared, you regret it. You think, no, I did something wrong. I shouldn't have done that. But at the time, it looked right. This is what it means by wisdom gets destroyed by sensual desire. It distorts the mind. It is what they call the vipallasa in the Pali. It's a distortion of the mind. And you no longer understand what is right and wrong. You no longer understand where happiness and suffering lies. And that is the problem with that is actually being described here. So it destroys wisdom or obstructs wisdom. It causes difficulties. Agata is like problems or difficulties or suffering or something like that. So sensual desire causes suffering. I've already talked about that in many ways, but also just the feeling of it is unpleasant. And it leads away from nibbana. It leads away from nibbana in many ways. First of all, you are on the wrong track because you are focusing on things that lead away from wisdom. But it also leads away from nibbana in the sense that nibbana is always a movement towards peace, right? A movement towards less defilements, a movement towards a simplification of things. Now, when you have craving, you're moving away from peace. You're moving towards agitation, towards restlessness and all these things. So you're going in the opposite direction of nibbana. Every time you have a successful meditation and you're feeling nice and peaceful, you are sort of moving a little bit towards nibbana. You're getting a little bit taste of what nibbana is like, right? It's peaceful, it's calm, This is a little bit of taste of what it is, except that Nibbana goes much, much further here. So these then are, so now you can see what is happening here. And then the Buddha says, when I considered in this way, in all of these ways, they subsided in me. And finally, at the very end, he says, this is how I abandoned these things, removed them, did away with them. So the power of wisdom, the power of understanding is much greater than the power of the will. And that's why it is preferable to use wisdom, use understanding whenever we can. Okay, so that is then that paragraph. In my opinion, it's a very interesting paragraph, very inspiring in many ways, and it says a lot about how the path should be practiced. And then the Buddha has exactly the same for ill will, and the same thing for vihingsa or hingsa in the next two paragraphs there. So again, you use exactly the same kind of contemplation for ill will. Ill will is even more important to overcome than sensual desire. And overcoming ill will is of course just as relevant for lay life as it is for monastic life. So this second paragraph here, if you substitute ill will in there, it is relevant for all of us, 100%. So again, you use the same kind of thinking. What does ill will lead to? And you know ill will leads to so many problems in life. So many of our interpersonal problems or problems between nations or problems between anybody is caused by ill will and anger. Not having enough compassion, understanding for other people, not enough metta, not enough friendliness, but instead ill will. It is one of the main sources, I think, for problems in our societies. I think it's very obvious. And how does ill will feel inside of you? It doesn't feel very good, does it? If you can choose between a sense of metta and kindness and ill will, it's very obvious which one feels better among those. And of course, ill will is a big one when it comes to distorting your mind and making you do bad things, right? Ill will is the one which convinces you that it's right to harm others even if it isn't. It's the one that convinces you that violence and oppression is okay, even though it actually isn't. I'm not going to go into great detail with ill will and harming or ruthlessness here, because we have basically gone through it already. It's about using your wisdom. And then when you use your wisdom, ill will is about to arise. You remember, no, wait a minute. And then you have made a very strong contemplation. You really understand why ill will is a problem. You remind yourself of that, and you can eliminate the ill will very quickly. But remember also, and this is another important principle of Dhamma, and the Buddha talks about this elsewhere, if a defilement is about to arise, it is very important to catch it early on. If a defilement becomes very strong in the mind, the ill will is already established, the desire is established, it's very hard to get rid of it at that point. And this is why the mindfulness is important. You can see with your mindfulness that this is leading in the wrong way. I'm about to get angry, I'm about to get all these desires. So if you see it early enough, that is the point when you can abandon it. Once it is established, often you just have to wait for it to pass, because it's actually very hard to get rid of it once it's actually there. Okay, so let us then move to the next paragraph here. I'm going to reverse these paragraphs. I'm going to go to paragraph 7 first of all, and then go to paragraph 6 afterwards. This is following the Chinese version. The sequence in the Chinese version is like that. So then comes a nice simile here, and the Buddha explains what he has just explained through a simile here. Just as in the last month of the rainy season, in the autumn, when the crops thicken, a cowherd would guard his cows by constantly tapping and poking them on this side and that with a stick to check and curb them. Why is that? Because he sees that he could be flogged, imprisoned, fined, or blamed if he let the cows stray into the crops. So too, I saw in unwholesome qualities danger, degradation, and defilements, and in wholesome qualities the blessing of renunciation, the aspect of cleansing. So again, you have here a very simple simile which gives you the idea of what is happening here. So you are like the cowherder. You are like herding your own mind, right? Your own mind needs a bit of tapping on this side, a bit of poking on that side, so it doesn't stray into the unwholesome thinking. Just like the cow straying into the crops, the wheat or whatever it would like to eat, obviously. So very, very kind of straightforward simile here. Because why is that? Because he sees that he will be flogged. In other words, he sees that it leads to suffering. Just like the unwholesome thoughts lead to suffering, allowing the cow to stray into the cow field leads to suffering for the cowherder. And he did that because he saw the degradation, the danger and the defilement in the unwholesome states. The danger we've been talking about already, the degradation is like it brings you low. It's like the opposite of arya. Arya is like the lofty stage, right? The noble person, the noble restraint of the senses. This is like I think it's called okara in Pali. It's like low, brings you down. And then the defilement in these things. You feel defiled. It's almost like you feel dirty if you have too much of these things. And the opposite being the case for the wholesome states, the aspect of cleansing, of purifying yourself. And this comes back to the soil remover at the very beginning. We are trying to clean ourselves, clean out the mind, purify the mind, get rid of the defilements. It's a gradual process that we're seeing here. And then we can go back to paragraph 6. And this paragraph goes as follows. Bhikkhus, whatever a bhikkhu frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of his mind. If he frequently thinks and ponders upon thoughts of sensual desire, he has abandoned the thought of renunciation to cultivate the thought of sensual desire. And then his mind inclines to thoughts of sensual desire. If he frequently thinks and ponders upon thoughts of ill will, upon thoughts of harming, he has abandoned the thought of non-harming to cultivate the thought of harming. And then his mind inclines to thoughts of harming. So that is another very interesting passage. And it shows you in many ways why it is so hard to change the way we think. And the reason why it is so hard is because we have habits, right? And we all know how difficult it is to change our habits. Sometimes we beat ourselves over the back. We say, I must do things different. I must do things in a different way. And then, soon afterwards, we do things in exactly the same way we did before. Because it is so ingrained in us. Habits are so much part of who we are. It's very hard to change. And that is what he's saying here. He's basically saying that if you often think in a certain way, the mind inclines that way. And because the mind inclines that way, this is like a habit. It tends to do the same thing again and again and again in the future. So part of this process of cultivation then is to basically to keep on looking at things in a new way as much as we possibly can. And when we do look at things in a new way, we are changing the inclination of the mind. We are gradually undermining the old habits and we are building up new habits inside of ourselves. And this is why this work is so hard, precisely because we're trying to change the habits of the person, habits of the mind. And we know how difficult that is. So, but of course the beautiful thing is that if you have success in this, if you are able to create habits where you have a sense of metta, a sense of compassion, where you don't have anger towards other beings, once that becomes a habit, then it means the mind goes by itself in that direction. You don't have to apply yourself so much anymore. You don't have to restrain yourself all the time, to hold back, to try to understand these things. It goes there by itself. What a beautiful thing that is, when sometimes you feel the mind goes by itself towards kindness, towards compassion, towards metta, all by itself. It's a very nice feeling, right? And it's very easy, it becomes very nice, very pleasant to live the Buddhist life in a good way when that happens. So, and they always say that the hardest part of the Buddhist life is at the beginning of the path, because at the beginning of the path, that's when you have to overcome all the old problems, all the old habits. But as you move along on the path, it becomes easier and more natural because the habits have changed. So it's an important thing to keep that in mind as well. And I will quickly now go through the opposite case before we stop for this morning. And the opposite case is, of course, then the cultivation of the good states of mind. Actually, it's already 2 minutes to 9. Maybe I should stop there, otherwise I might be pushing things a little bit. So maybe this afternoon we can come back and we can look at the opposite side and discuss that a little bit, and then see where we go from there. Okay, so let us just all pay our respects to Buddha's Dhamma Sangha together here.